He had the house, the pension, the friends who still called him solid. A life most would envy. Stable, predictable, comfortable. But every morning, he woke up with a quiet ache in his chest. No tragedy, no recent heartbreak. Just emptiness. And for the first time in years, he whispered something he'd never said out loud. I have everything I thought I wanted. So why do I feel nothing? Every man was taught this lie long before he knew its cost. From the time he was a boy, he was told what it meant to be a man, not in lectures, but in looks, in expectations, in the silence that followed when he cried, in the praise he only received when he endured. He learned early, don't need too much, don't feel too much, and whatever you do, never ever fall apart in front of anyone. They called it strength. They said it was manhood. So he did what he was taught. He worked hard, stayed late, fixed what was broken, carried what was heavy, and never asked for help. He showed up for everyone, for decades, to the job that never loved him back, to the family that sometimes forgot he had feelings too, to the woman who stopped asking what made him happy years ago. He provided, protected, performed, pushed through. Birthdays came and went. Vacations were postponed. Hobbies were shelved. And slowly, year after year, he stopped checking in with himself, because there was always someone else who needed something more. And yet, no one ever told him this. If you give everything, without keeping something for yourself, one day, you'll wake up in a life you built, but feel like a stranger living in it. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even lost. He was just tired. Tired of carrying every weight in silence. Tired of fixing everything, except himself. Tired of nodding through pain and calling it fine. Tired of being the man everyone could count on, while silently wondering, can I count on anyone? Because somewhere along the way, he became a title, not a person. The provider, the husband, the dad, the backbone, the rock. But who was he? When he wasn't building, solving, earning, serving, no one asked. And to be honest, he stopped asking too, until the silence got louder than the expectations, until the quiet evenings stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling empty. Because being strong all the time eventually weakens the soul. And what no one tells most men is this: you can spend your whole life being useful and still feel completely unseen. That's the lie he was taught. That usefulness equals worth. That self-sacrifice equals love. That staying silent equals strength. But deep down, even if he never said it out loud, he longed for someone, not who needed him, but who truly saw him, even when he wasn't doing anything at all. He had the life everyone admired, but none of it felt like his. He had it all. Or at least, that's what it looked like. The house was paid off. The fridge was full. The car was reliable. The calendar had appointments, meetings, dinners, birthdays. There were no emergencies, no screaming matches, no visible cracks. And yet, every night, as he turned off the lights one by one, as silence slowly filled each room, a question echoed louder than ever. Why do I feel so empty? He wasn't in crisis. There was no disaster to fix. But something inside him had quietly gone missing. And the cruel part? He didn't even know when it happened. It wasn't one moment, not one betrayal, not one tragedy. It was subtle, slow, like a slow leak in a tire. You don't notice it until you're stranded on the side of the road. That's how emptiness works in men like him. It sneaks in quietly, between responsibilities, between moments of being strong, between nods of approval that feel more like obligation than love. People saw his life and called it successful. They envied his structure, admired his discipline, praised his consistency. But what they couldn't see was how long it had been, since he laughed and meant it, since he cried and wasn't ashamed of it, since he sat in silence not to numb, but to feel. Because here's the truth. A full schedule doesn't mean a full soul. A steady paycheck doesn't mean a steady heart. And having everything means nothing if you no longer feel alive inside of it. He realized he had built a life that worked, but not one that warmed him. He had become efficient, but not emotionally present. He had mastered how to meet everyone else's needs, but forgot how to even name his own. And the world applauded it. They said, "Look how responsible he is." Such a strong man. Reliable, consistent, stoic. But no one asked, what's nourishing him? Because men like him, they don't raise their hands. They don't say, I'm lonely. They don't say, I don't recognize myself anymore. Instead, they keep going. Until one day, the illusion of a full life starts to crack under the weight of emotional starvation. And that's where he found himself, sitting in a room full of trophies, tools, memories, routines, but feeling like a stranger to his own joy. Because what no one told him was this: you can have everything and still feel nothing. You can do everything right and still feel completely wrong inside. And that kind of emptiness doesn't come from failure. It comes from forgetting that you're allowed to be more than useful. You're allowed to feel, to dream, to want, to need. But for decades, he hadn't asked himself what he needed. He just kept delivering. And now, the cost was catching up, not in dollars, but in a silence that felt more like absence, not of people, but of himself. No one talks about this, the quiet cost of being the strong one. He never considered himself a martyr. He didn't think he was sacrificing. He called it being there, called it doing the right thing. He gave, because that's what good men do. He gave his time, his money, his presence, his patience, his silence. He gave space to others. Even when no one gave him space to breathe, he gave chances. Even when forgiveness cost him his peace, he gave reassurance. Even when no one reassured him in return. And it never felt wrong. Not at first, because giving made him feel useful, needed, valuable. But here's what he didn't see, until it was too late. There is a price to always giving, and eventually, someone has to pay it. He thought love meant effort, that loyalty meant overextending, that being dependable meant being endlessly available. He didn't realize, every time he gave without boundaries, he was slowly teaching people that he didn't have any, and they believed him. They stopped asking if he was okay, stopped noticing when he was drained, stopped offering anything in return. Because why would they? He never required it. He made giving look easy, so they forgot it was costing him something. And eventually, the cost became unbearable. Not in loud breakdowns, but in subtle fractures. He started waking up tired, even after sleeping 8 hours. He started dreading small interactions, not because of the people, but because of the pretending. He found himself snapping at little things, avoiding messages, forgetting birthdays not out of neglect, but from emotional depletion. His soul was overdrafted, and no one noticed the debt, except him. Because when a man always gives, people stop asking if he needs. When a man always shows up, no one thinks to ask what it costs him to stay. And when a man becomes the emotional anchor for everyone else, he often forgets how to swim for himself. That's when the resentment began. Not loud, not cruel, just internal. He resented how invisible he felt, how unappreciated, how useful became his only value. And the worst part? He blamed himself. He thought, maybe I'm not giving enough. Maybe I'm being selfish for feeling this way. Oh? Maybe this is what it means to be a man. But deep down, a quieter voice began to rise. What if giving isn't love if it's destroying you? What if being strong is just another way to stay silent? And that question changed everything, because it forced him to face a truth most men avoid. Love is not proven through depletion, and loyalty means nothing if it requires self-abandonment. He didn't choose solitude at first, but somehow it chose him. At first, the silence felt brutal, not poetic, not peaceful, just loud. He didn't know what to do with the quiet, the stillness, the space that used to be filled with other people's voices, other people's needs, other people's moods. Now, it was just him, his coffee, his thoughts, his ache. He tried to fill the silence at first, television in the background, music always playing, scrolling social media until his eyes burned. But nothing worked, because noise doesn't cure emptiness. It just hides it, for a while. Then one evening, he turned everything off, not out of wisdom, but exhaustion, and the silence rushed in like a wave. At first, it stung. It reminded him how disconnected he'd become from himself. He didn't know what he enjoyed anymore, didn't know what he wanted for dinner, Didn't remember the last time he laughed not to entertain, but to feel. He had spent so many years adjusting to other people's rhythms that he had forgotten his own. But something unexpected happened that night. In that silence, he heard a voice he hadn't heard in years. His own. Not the version of him that everyone leaned on. Not the role he played. Not the man who smiled to keep the peace. But the boy he once was, before duty swallowed dreams, before schedules replaced stillness. And that boy wasn't asking for applause. He was asking to be remembered. So he leaned in. Just a little. He didn't book a trip, didn't shave his head or start over. He just started listening. He journaled before sunrise. He walked without a destination. He cooked slowly, ate slower. He read books that stirred something in him. Listened to jazz not because it was trendy, but because the saxophone made him feel something he couldn't name. He prayed not for answers, but for presence. And little by little, solitude stopped feeling like punishment. It started feeling like a classroom. And in that classroom, he relearned how to rest without guilt, how to breathe without rushing, how to be without performing. He began showing up for himself, the same way he always had for others. And that changed everything, because when a man rediscovers the peace of his own presence, he becomes far less willing to sacrifice it for chaos. He no longer craved someone to complete the day. He enjoyed people but didn't need them. And that distinction, that's where his power returned, because the man who finds wholeness alone is no longer afraid of losing anyone. And the man who makes peace his home will never again beg for entry into someone else's. There comes a moment when a man stops chasing and starts choosing. There was a time he would have done anything for love. He would have driven hours for a half smile, bit his tongue in arguments just to keep the peace, overlooked red flags, just to keep something warm next to him at night. He used to believe that effort could fix everything, that if he just tried harder, gave more, waited longer, softened every edge of himself, then maybe he'd finally be chosen, fully, freely, finally. But here's what years of chasing taught him. Being chosen out of pity is not the same as being chosen with passion. Being tolerated is not the same as being wanted. And so many times, he mistook the absence of rejection as proof of love. But it wasn't. It was convenience. It was comfort. It was someone needing what he gave, not someone loving who he was. So one day, he stopped chasing, not out of pride, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity, because he realized no amount of chasing can convince the wrong heart to stay, and the right heart never needs to be convinced. He no longer begs for attention. He no longer auditions for connection. He no longer gives everything up front, just to earn a maybe from someone unsure. He doesn't text twice when she doesn't answer. He doesn't explain his worth to those who don't see it. And he no longer walks into rooms trying to be liked. Because a man who has chased long enough eventually learns that love, when it's real, doesn't require pursuit. It requires presence. And he has that now, with himself, with his peace, with his purpose. So he no longer chases women who need fixing, or rescuing, or convincing. He's not interested in being someone's second chance, or their maybe one day, or their emotional project. He's not hard to love. He's just no longer chasing those who can't receive it. And the irony? Now that he no longer chases, he's more attractive than ever. Not because he plays games, but because he plays no games at all. His calm is unshakable. His pace is his own. And his silence, it speaks volumes. Because a man who doesn't chase is a man who knows what he's worth and refuses to spend another day proving it to someone who never truly looked. He no longer seeks validation. He seeks alignment and nothing less. He used to live out of alignment, smiling when he wanted to stay silent, saying yes when every fiber in him screamed no, staying when his soul had already packed its bags. He wasn't fake. He was just afraid. Afraid that if he ever showed up as his true self, he'd be too much, or not enough. So for years, he shaped himself around other people's comfort, smoothed his edges, softened his voice, lowered his gaze. And the more he dimmed his own light, the more invisible he became, until one day, he looked in the mirror and realized he didn't recognize the man staring back, not because he had failed, but because he had forgotten what he loved, forgotten how he moved when no one was watching, forgotten the sound of his own intuition. Because the world had gotten too loud, that's when everything shifted. He stopped chasing alignment with others and started chasing alignment with himself. He simplified, cut ties with noise, took space from people who only loved the version of him that performed. He started listening again to the still, quiet voice inside. And that voice didn't ask him to hustle harder, didn't shame him for resting, didn't beg for approval. That voice said, "You're enough without the applause. You're loved even when you're alone. You're powerful when you're honest." He began to live differently. Not louder, not flashier, just truer. He said what he meant without cruelty. He protected his peace without apology. He walked away not in anger, but in alignment, because the man aligned with himself doesn't need to prove anything. He's not trying to be understood by everyone. He's not trying to convince the world of his goodness. He knows. He knows who he is when no one's watching. He knows what he believes even if others disagree. He knows what he will and will never tolerate again. And that kind of man, he becomes magnetic, not because he shouts, but because he no longer whispers when truth is required. Not because he dominates a room, but because his presence feels like peace. Not because he's perfect, but because he's whole, and wholeness is rare. Because a man aligned with himself is no longer moved by flattery, no longer fooled by surface, no longer shaken by rejection. He doesn't seek love to complete him. He brings love with him. He doesn't beg for connection. He filters for alignment. And most of all, he doesn't fear solitude anymore. Because now, solitude feels like a home, built on truth, warmed by clarity, and guarded by boundaries he no longer breaks. Not even for love. A man who walks alone but in alignment becomes dangerous in the best way. If you're a man over Hannah can't, and you've ever woken up wondering why your full life feels so hollow, you're not broken. You're not ungrateful. You're not alone. You're just finally feeling what you were too busy to notice before. You've lived for others. Now it's time to live for the man who made it all possible. The one who stayed strong. The one who stayed silent. The one who showed up every day. You. And now, it's time you showed up for yourself.